When my department head called me unreliable during that Tuesday morning staff meeting, I simply nodded and made a mental note to update my resignation letter that evening. I had been working every weekend for the past 2 years, every single one. While he spent his weekends playing golf at the country club, I was in the office ensuring our quarterly reports met federal compliance deadlines. The irony wasn't lost on me, and apparently it wouldn't be lost on him either once he read what I had prepared. Let me take you back to how this all began, because the story of my professional vindication started long before that fateful Tuesday morning. 2 years and 3 months earlier, I joined Morrison & Associates as a senior compliance analyst. The firm specialized in regulatory consulting for mid-tier financial institutions, and my role involved ensuring our client portfolios remained compliant with an increasingly complex web of federal regulations. When I accepted the position, I knew the work would be demanding. What I didn't anticipate was how demanding my immediate supervisor, Department Head Robert Carlson, would make it. Carlson had been with the firm for 15 years, climbing the ranks through what I would later understand was a combination of political maneuvering and strategic credit-taking. He possessed that particular brand of corporate confidence that comes from never having his expertise truly tested. During my first week, he explained that compliance work was simply about following checklists and maintaining documentation. I recognized immediately that his understanding of our field was superficial at best. The reality of compliance work in financial consulting is far more nuanced than checkbox management. Regulations change quarterly, sometimes monthly. Interpretation requires not just knowledge of current statutes, but understanding of regulatory intent, precedent cases, and the intricate relationships between different governing bodies. When the Dodd-Frank amendments were revised in my 3rd month, Carlson assigned me to review the changes and provide a summary. What should have been a 2-page memo became a 40-page analysis because the amendments created conflicts with existing SOX compliance requirements that could expose our clients to significant penalties. I spent that first weekend researching case precedents and consulting with former colleagues at the Treasury Department. The work was intricate, requiring cross-referencing multiple regulatory frameworks and predicting how field auditors might interpret ambiguous language. When I presented my findings on Monday morning, Carlson scanned the first page and set it aside, commenting that I was overthinking things. 3 weeks later, when our largest client received a preliminary audit notice specifically addressing the conflicts I had identified, Carlson scheduled an emergency client meeting and presented my analysis as his own comprehensive review. This pattern established itself quickly. I would identify potential compliance issues, research solutions, and develop implementation strategies. Carlson would review my work, often dismissing its complexity, then present the crucial elements to clients and senior management as his insights. Initially, I rationalized this as normal workplace hierarchy. Department heads synthesized their team's work and represent it externally. But as months passed, I began to understand that Carlson genuinely believed he was adding value through this process. The weekend work started during my 4th month when the Federal Reserve announced surprise changes to stress testing requirements. Our clients needed updated compliance frameworks within 30 days, and the changes were substantial enough to require completely restructuring their risk assessment protocols. Carlson assigned me the project on a Friday afternoon, mentioning casually that the deadline was tight but manageable with focused effort. I spent that weekend at the office, not because the work couldn't wait until Monday, but because I understood something Carlson did not. Compliance failures in financial services don't result in missed deadlines or disappointed customers. They result in federal investigations, regulatory sanctions, and potential criminal liability for client executives. The weight of that responsibility meant that manageable deadlines became urgent priorities, and urgent priorities became weekend work. Over the following months, weekend work became routine. Regulatory changes seemed to arrive with particular frequency on Thursday and Friday afternoons, creating artificial urgency for Monday morning deliverables. I began to suspect these tight deadlines were Carlson's method of maintaining control over the workflow while ensuring he could present himself as responsive to client needs. The work itself was intellectually challenging in ways I found deeply satisfying. Financial compliance exists at the intersection of law, economics, and risk management. Each regulatory framework tells a story about market failures, legislative responses, and the ongoing evolution of financial oversight. Understanding these frameworks requires not just memorizing rules, but grasping the economic principles they're designed to address. During my 6th month, I identified a significant gap in our standard compliance protocols. Most of our mid-tier financial clients operated under the assumption that certain derivatives trading activities fell below regulatory thresholds and therefore required minimal oversight. My weekend research revealed that recent CFTC guidance had effectively lowered these thresholds, bringing many of our clients into scope for much more extensive reporting requirements. I drafted a comprehensive memo outlining the issue, potential client exposure, and recommended remediation steps. The memo required 2 weekends of research because the regulatory guidance was embedded in technical amendments to existing rules rather than announced as standalone policy changes. Most compliance officers would miss these changes until their next full regulatory review, potentially months later. When I presented the memo to Carlson, he initially dismissed it as unnecessary complexity. His exact words were that I was creating problems where none existed. However, when I mentioned the potential penalties for noncompliance could reach 7 figures per client, his attention sharpened considerably. Within 2 hours, he had scheduled meetings with our 3 largest clients to discuss updating their compliance frameworks. During those client meetings, Carlson presented my findings as his own discovery, explaining how his thorough review of recent regulatory developments had identified this critical issue. He never mentioned the weekend research or the complexity of tracking changes across multiple regulatory frameworks. To the clients, he appeared to be a department head with exceptional attention to detail and deep regulatory knowledge. This pattern intensified over the following year. Complex regulatory analysis became routine weekend work, and significant findings became Carlson's presentations to clients and senior management. I began to understand that my actual role was not senior compliance analyst, but rather ghost researcher for Carlson's reputation as a regulatory expert. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely if not for the Morrison & Associates annual review process. During my 18-month review, senior management praised my technical work, but noted concerns about my visibility within the firm. The feedback suggested I should take more initiative in client relationships and develop stronger presentation skills. The irony was profound, considering I had been developing detailed regulatory analysis that was generating significant client value, but receiving none of the credit for that work. More troubling was Carlson's written evaluation, which described my work as competent but noted concerns about my reliability and initiative. He specifically mentioned that I seemed to require extensive guidance on complex projects and suggested I needed to develop more independent analytical skills. Reading this evaluation while sitting in the office on a Saturday afternoon, researching regulatory implications of the latest Basel III amendments, I began to understand that our professional relationship had become fundamentally unsustainable. The following months brought increasing tension between Carlson's public persona as a regulatory expert and his private dependence on my weekend research. During client meetings, he would make commitments about regulatory analysis timelines that required immediate weekend work to fulfill. When I raised concerns about workload distribution, he would remind me that client service was our primary obligation and that successful professionals needed to demonstrate flexibility and commitment. Meanwhile, my own professional development was stagnating. While I was producing high-quality regulatory analysis, I had no opportunity to present findings to clients or senior management. My expertise was being filtered through Carlson's interpretation, often losing crucial nuance in the process. More concerning, I was beginning to identify significant gaps in Carlson's understanding of regulatory frameworks that could expose the firm to professional liability. The breaking point came during our work on the comprehensive capital analysis and review requirements for a major regional bank client. The CCAR framework requires financial institutions to demonstrate their capital planning processes can withstand severe economic stress scenarios. The analysis involves complex modeling of potential losses across different business lines under various economic conditions. Carlson assigned me the project with his usual confidence, noting that it was simply a matter of applying standard stress testing methodologies. However, CCAR analysis for regional banks involves integrating multiple regulatory frameworks, including Basel III capital requirements, FDIC resolution planning, and Federal Reserve supervisory expectations. The methodology requires understanding not just current regulations, but how supervisory guidance has evolved over multiple examination cycles. I spent 3 consecutive weekends developing the analysis framework, consulting with former Federal Reserve colleagues, and modeling various stress scenarios. The work required integrating economic research, regulatory precedent, and client-specific operational data. The final framework was sophisticated enough to serve as a template for similar regional bank clients, while being tailored specifically to address our client's particular risk profile. When I presented the analysis to Carlson, he spent 15 minutes reviewing the executive summary before approving it for client presentation. His only comment was that the analysis seemed unnecessarily complex for what he characterized as a straightforward regulatory requirement. 2 days later, he presented the framework to the client as his department's comprehensive CCAR analysis, receiving significant praise for the sophistication and thoroughness of the approach. The client meeting was my first indication of how extensively Carlson had been representing my work as his own. During the presentation, he fielded technical questions about the stress testing methodology, with answers that were clearly paraphrased from my written analysis. When the client's chief risk officer asked about specific regulatory precedents that informed our approach, Carlson referenced cases I had researched and cited in my background documentation. Following the client meeting, senior management commended Carlson for developing such a comprehensive regulatory framework. His annual performance review that year specifically highlighted his expertise in complex compliance analysis and his ability to deliver sophisticated regulatory solutions under tight deadlines. Meanwhile, my own review again noted concerns about initiative and visibility, suggesting I needed to take more ownership of client relationships. This disconnect between my actual contributions and my perceived performance became the foundation for my strategic thinking about professional vindication. I began to understand that continuing in my current role would not lead to appropriate recognition or career advancement. More importantly, I recognized that Carlson's dependence on my weekend research had created a vulnerability that he probably didn't fully appreciate. Over the following months, I began documenting my work more systematically. Every weekend research project was saved with detailed version control, showing the evolution of analysis from initial assignment to final presentation. I maintained copies of all client deliverables with timestamps showing when I completed the work versus when Carlson presented it. Most importantly, I began tracking the gap between Carlson's public statements about regulatory issues and his private requests for research support. During this period, my weekend work continued to intensify. Regulatory developments seemed to accelerate, with new guidance from multiple agencies requiring constant analysis and client communication. What I began to understand was that Carlson had built his reputation on being extraordinarily responsive to regulatory changes, always having immediate analysis available for client questions. This responsiveness was entirely dependent on my weekend research, but he had never acknowledged this dependency publicly. The pattern became particularly clear during the Volcker Rule implementation period. The Volcker Rule restricts banks from proprietary trading while allowing market making and hedging activities. However, distinguishing between prohibited proprietary trading and permitted market making requires sophisticated analysis of trading intent, risk management practices, and documentation standards. Most financial institutions struggled with this distinction, creating significant demand for specialized compliance advice. Carlson positioned our firm as having particular expertise in Volcker Rule compliance, securing several large consulting engagements based on this claimed specialization. However, his actual understanding of the Volcker Rule was limited to basic prohibitions and exceptions. The detailed analysis required to help clients develop compliant trading practices required weekend research into Federal Reserve guidance, case studies of enforcement actions, and consultation with former banking regulators. I spent most weekends during this period developing Volcker Rule compliance frameworks, researching enforcement precedents, and drafting client guidance documents. The work was intellectually challenging and professionally valuable, but it was also becoming clear that Carlson viewed this arrangement as sustainable indefinitely. From his perspective, he had identified a regulatory expert who was willing to work weekends to support his client relationships and professional reputation. What Carlson failed to recognize was that my expertise was becoming increasingly valuable in the broader market. Other firms were actively recruiting compliance professionals with specialized knowledge of post-crisis regulatory frameworks. My weekend research had given me deep expertise in areas where many compliance professionals had only surface-level understanding. This expertise was portable and increasingly in demand. The decision to begin my exit strategy occurred during a particularly demanding weekend when Carlson assigned me 3 separate regulatory analysis projects with Monday morning deadlines. Each project required substantial research and would normally constitute a full weekend's work. When I mentioned the time constraints, Carlson suggested I prioritize more effectively and perhaps spend less time on unnecessary details. That Sunday evening, working on the 3rd analysis project at nearly midnight, I began drafting my resignation letter. Not because I was frustrated with the workload, but because I had finally recognized that my professional relationship with Carlson was fundamentally exploitative. He was building his career on my expertise while ensuring I received no credit for the work that was generating his success. The resignation letter took several weeks to perfect. I wanted it to be professional, factual, and devastating. More importantly, I wanted it to highlight the contradiction between Carlson's public persona as regulatory expert and his private dependence on my weekend research. The letter needed to be sufficiently detailed that senior management would understand the extent of my contributions, while remaining diplomatic enough to avoid burning professional bridges. During this period, I also began preparing for my post-resignation transition. I documented all the regulatory frameworks I had developed, the client relationships I had supported, and the specialized knowledge I had accumulated. Most importantly, I began reaching out to former colleagues and industry contacts about potential opportunities. The job market for specialized compliance professionals was remarkably strong. The post-crisis regulatory environment had created demand for professionals who understood the intricate relationships between different regulatory frameworks. My weekend research had given me exactly this type of specialized knowledge, and several firms expressed immediate interest in my background. What surprised me during these conversations was how well-known my work had become in the broader compliance community. Several potential employers mentioned specific regulatory analysis that had influenced their own thinking, analysis that Carlson had presented at industry conferences and client seminars. My work was receiving recognition in the professional community, but that recognition was being attributed to Carlson rather than to me. This realization strengthened my resolve about resignation. I was not simply leaving an unsatisfactory job. I was reclaiming professional credit for work that was generating significant value. The resignation letter became a vehicle for establishing appropriate attribution for my contributions to the firm's regulatory practice. The Tuesday morning staff meeting when Carlson called me unreliable was actually perfect timing. I had planned to submit my resignation that week, but his comment provided ideal context for my departure. During the meeting, he was discussing client service standards and mentioned that team members needed to be more reliable in their availability for urgent projects. When he looked directly at me while making this comment, I understood that he was referencing my recent questions about weekend work distribution. The irony was extraordinary. For 2 years, I had been the most reliable member of his team, available every weekend for regulatory research that supported his client relationships and professional reputation. Now, because I had begun questioning this arrangement, he was characterizing me as unreliable. The comment revealed that he genuinely believed his success was due to his own expertise rather than his team's support. After the meeting, I returned to my office and finalized my resignation letter. The letter was 3 pages long and structured to accomplish several objectives. First, it provided notice of my departure and transition timeline. Second, it documented my contributions to the firm's regulatory practice over the past 2 years. Third, it highlighted the weekend work that had enabled the department's responsiveness to client needs. Finally, it offered to assist with transition planning to ensure continuity of service. The letter was professionally written but unmistakably clear about my role in generating the regulatory expertise that had become Carlson's professional trademark. I included specific examples of client deliverables I had developed, regulatory frameworks I had created, and weekend research projects that had supported major client relationships. The documentation was factual and verifiable, making it impossible for Carlson to dismiss my contributions. I submitted the letter to Carlson at 4:30 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon, then sent copies to HR and senior management as required by firm policy. My expectation was that Carlson would read the letter, perhaps schedule a meeting to discuss transition planning, and begin preparing for my departure. His actual reaction exceeded my most optimistic expectations for professional vindication. Within 30 minutes of receiving the letter, Carlson appeared at my office door. His face was flushed, and he was holding the resignation letter with both hands. He asked if we could speak privately, then closed my office door and sat down across from my desk. For the next 20 minutes, he attempted to convince me that my resignation was unnecessary and that we could address any concerns I had about workload or recognition. What became clear during this conversation was that Carlson had never fully grasped how dependent his success was on my weekend research. He understood that I produced high-quality analysis, but he had somehow convinced himself that this analysis was the result of his effective management and guidance, rather than my specialized expertise. My resignation letter forced him to confront the reality that his regulatory expertise was largely derived from my work. The conversation was remarkable for what it revealed about Carlson's understanding of our working relationship. He repeatedly referenced his role in developing my analytical skills and guiding my professional growth. When I mentioned the weekend work, he characterized it as valuable experience that was preparing me for senior-level responsibilities. He seemed genuinely surprised when I explained that working every weekend for 2 years was not sustainable or professionally appropriate. More telling was his response when I mentioned the lack of recognition for my contributions. He explained that client presentations were his responsibility as department head, and that my role was to provide technical support for these presentations. When I noted that my analysis was being presented as his insights, he suggested that this was normal workflow in professional service firms. His inability to understand why this attribution was problematic revealed the depth of his blind spot about professional credit and recognition. The conversation ended when Carlson asked what it would take to retain me. I explained that my concerns weren't about compensation or benefits, but about professional development and appropriate recognition for my contributions. When he asked for specific examples, I referenced several client presentations where my research had been presented as his analysis. His response was that client relationships required senior-level representation, and that he was ensuring my work received appropriate exposure through his presentations. At that point, I understood that Carlson genuinely believed he was providing me with valuable career development by translating my technical analysis into client-facing presentations. He had no recognition that this arrangement was preventing me from developing client relationships or receiving professional credit for my expertise. The conversation confirmed that resignation was not just appropriate, but necessary for my professional development. Wednesday morning brought the first indication of how my departure would affect the department's operations. Carlson scheduled an emergency meeting with our largest client to discuss ongoing regulatory projects. During the meeting, which I attended as part of transition planning, the client asked several technical questions about recent regulatory developments that Carlson was unable to answer without referring to notes I had prepared. The client's chief compliance officer asked about potential implications of proposed changes to stress testing requirements, a topic I had been researching over the previous weekend. Carlson's response was vague and suggested we would need to conduct additional analysis before providing recommendations. When the client pressed for preliminary thoughts, Carlson looked to me for input, then attempted to paraphrase my explanation as his own assessment. What struck me during this meeting was how comfortable Carlson had become with this dynamic. He would field client questions, defer to my expertise for technical answers, then reframe my responses as his analysis. The client seemed accustomed to this pattern, suggesting it had been ongoing throughout our professional relationship. However, the client also seemed to recognize that the substantive expertise was coming from me rather than from Carlson. After the meeting, the client's chief compliance officer approached me privately to express regret about my departure. She mentioned that my analysis had been particularly valuable to their compliance program and asked if I would be available for consulting work after leaving Morrison & Associates. This conversation was my first indication that clients understood the source of the regulatory expertise they were receiving. Over the following days, similar conversations occurred with other clients and colleagues. Several mentioned specific regulatory analysis that had influenced their thinking, always attributing the work to me rather than to Carlson. I began to understand that while Carlson believed he was receiving credit for my work, the broader professional community recognized my contributions more clearly than I had realized. Thursday brought what I would later consider the most satisfying moment of my resignation process. Carlson approached me with a complex regulatory question from another client, asking if I could prepare a preliminary analysis by Friday morning. The question involved potential conflicts between new derivatives reporting requirements and existing Bank Secrecy Act obligations, exactly the type of intricate regulatory analysis that had become my specialty. I explained that my transition responsibilities precluded taking on new research projects and suggested he might want to begin developing internal expertise to handle such questions after my departure. His response revealed that he had never considered how the department would manage complex regulatory analysis without my support. For 2 years, he had operated under the assumption that my weekend research was simply part of normal operations, rather than specialized expertise that would need to be replaced. The conversation that followed was illuminating. Carlson asked how long it would typically take to research the client's question, and I explained that it would require at least a full weekend of regulatory research and consultation with former colleagues at regulatory agencies. When he asked if this was unusual, I mentioned that most of our sophisticated regulatory analysis required similar time investment. He seemed genuinely surprised to learn that the quick turnaround he had promised clients was dependent on my weekend work. Friday afternoon brought the final confirmation that my resignation was achieving its intended effect. Senior management scheduled a meeting to discuss transition planning and to understand the scope of my responsibilities. During this meeting, it became clear that they had not fully understood my role in generating the department's regulatory expertise. The senior partner asked about specific client deliverables I had mentioned in my resignation letter, and I provided detailed explanations of the research and analysis involved in each project. When he asked how these projects were typically managed, I explained the weekend research process and the timeline constraints that had made this schedule necessary. His questions revealed that senior management had viewed Carlson as an unusually productive department head without understanding the support structure that enabled this productivity. More significantly, the senior partner asked about the specialized knowledge required for our regulatory practice and how the firm would maintain this expertise after my departure. I provided a detailed assessment of the regulatory frameworks we regularly analyze, the research resources required to stay current with developments, and the client expectations we had established around turnaround times for complex analysis. By the end of this conversation, senior management understood that my departure represented a significant gap in the firm's regulatory capabilities. The specialized expertise I had developed through weekend research was not easily replaceable, and the client service standards Carlson had established were dependent on this expertise. My resignation letter had achieved its primary objective of establishing appropriate recognition for my contributions. The following week brought a series of developments that exceeded my expectations for professional vindication. On Monday morning, Carlson received a complex regulatory question from our largest client with a requested response time of 24 hours. Without my support, he was unable to provide even preliminary analysis within this timeframe. The client's follow-up questions revealed that they had become accustomed to rapid turnaround on sophisticated regulatory analysis and were surprised by the delay. Tuesday brought similar challenges with two other clients who submitted regulatory questions, expecting quick responses based on previous experience. Carlson's attempts to handle these questions revealed the extent of his dependence on my research support. His responses lacked the technical depth and regulatory insight that clients had come to expect from the firm's compliance practice. By Wednesday, senior management was receiving direct client feedback about the decline in regulatory analysis quality. The largest client specifically requested a meeting to discuss continuity of service, expressing concerns about the firm's ability to maintain its previous standards of regulatory expertise. This client feedback forced senior management to confront the reality that a significant portion of the firm's regulatory capability had been concentrated in my weekend research. Thursday brought what I considered complete professional vindication. Senior management scheduled a meeting with Carlson to discuss the department's operations and capability gaps. Following this meeting, they approached me about extending my departure timeline to assist with transition planning and knowledge transfer. More importantly, they requested detailed documentation of the regulatory frameworks and research methodologies I had developed. The meeting with senior management was professionally satisfying in ways I had not anticipated. They asked specific questions about regulatory analysis processes, client service standards, and the expertise required to maintain the firm's compliance practice. My answers revealed that I had been functioning as the department's primary regulatory expert while being managed as a junior analyst. More significantly, senior management expressed surprise about the weekend work arrangement and questioned whether this was sustainable for other team members. When I explained that most sophisticated regulatory analysis required extended research time, they began to understand that the department's productivity was built on an unsustainable foundation rather than exceptional efficiency. The conversation concluded with senior management requesting a comprehensive assessment of the regulatory expertise required to maintain client service standards. They also asked me to identify potential external resources or consulting arrangements that could provide continuity after my departure. These requests confirmed that my resignation letter had successfully highlighted the gap between Carlson's public persona and his actual regulatory expertise. Friday brought the final element of my professional vindication. The client who had initially approached me about consulting work formally requested that Morrison & Associates arrange for me to continue providing regulatory analysis on a consulting basis after my departure. This request came directly to senior management, bypassing Carlson entirely, and specifically referenced the quality and sophistication of analysis I had provided over the previous 2 years. Senior management's response to this client request was revealing. They approached me about establishing a consulting arrangement that would allow me to continue supporting key client relationships while pursuing other opportunities. The proposed arrangement would involve direct client relationships rather than working through Carlson, essentially acknowledging that clients valued my expertise independently of the department structure. This consulting proposal represented complete professional vindication. Not only had my resignation highlighted my contributions to the firm's regulatory practice, but it had also created an opportunity for direct client relationships and appropriate recognition for my expertise. The weekend research that had been invisible to senior management was now understood as specialized capability that clients specifically valued. My final week at Morrison & Associates provided additional confirmation of the impact my departure was having on the department's operations. Carlson struggled to respond to routine regulatory questions without my research support, leading to delayed client responses and reduced quality of analysis. Several clients specifically requested updates on regulatory developments that had been part of my regular weekend research, highlighting how much they had relied on this information. More telling was Carlson's attempt to convince other team members to take on additional regulatory research responsibilities. However, none of the other analysts had the specialized knowledge or research relationships necessary to provide the sophisticated analysis that had become the department's trademark. Their attempts to fill this gap revealed how unique my expertise had become within the firm. During my final week, I also received multiple job offers from firms that had learned about my departure through professional networks. The market response to my availability confirmed that the expertise I had developed through weekend research was highly valued in the broader compliance community. Several potential employers specifically mentioned my reputation for sophisticated regulatory analysis and offered compensation packages that reflected this expertise. My last day at Morrison & Associates included an exit interview with HR that provided final confirmation of my professional vindication. The HR director asked detailed questions about my role in the department, the weekend work arrangement, and my reasons for leaving. Her questions revealed that senior management was conducting a comprehensive review of the department's operations and management practices. More importantly, the HR director mentioned that several clients had provided feedback about my contributions to their compliance programs, always referencing specific analysis or insights that had been particularly valuable. This client feedback had prompted senior management to recognize that my role had been significantly more substantial than Carlson's performance evaluations had indicated. The exit interview concluded with the HR director expressing regret about my departure and noting that the firm would need to restructure its regulatory practice to address the capability gap my resignation had created. She also mentioned that my resignation letter had prompted valuable conversations about recognition and attribution within professional service teams. 6 months after my departure, I learned through professional networks that Morrison & Associates had hired 2 additional compliance analysts and engaged an external consulting firm to support their regulatory practice. The cost of replacing my weekend research capability was substantially higher than my previous compensation, confirming that my contributions had been undervalued relative to their impact on the firm's operations. More satisfying was learning that Carlson's reputation as a regulatory expert had diminished significantly after my departure. Without my research support, he was unable to maintain the quick turnaround and sophisticated analysis that had been his professional trademark. Several clients had moved their regulatory consulting work to other firms, citing concerns about the quality and timeliness of analysis. The consulting arrangement I had established with Morrison & Associates lasted for 8 months, providing direct client relationships and appropriate compensation for my expertise. During this period, I worked directly with clients on complex regulatory projects, receiving full credit for my analysis and building professional relationships based on my specialized knowledge. Most importantly, this consulting work led to a permanent position with one of the clients as their chief compliance officer. The role provided the professional recognition and career advancement that had been impossible while working under Carlson's management. My weekend research had become the foundation for a senior-level compliance career with appropriate recognition and compensation. Looking back on this experience, I understand that my professional vindication was not about proving Carlson wrong or damaging his career. Instead, it was about establishing appropriate recognition for expertise and ensuring that my professional development reflected my actual contributions. The resignation letter was simply a tool for highlighting the disconnect between perception and reality in our working relationship. The broader lesson from this experience is that professional vindication requires strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction. By documenting my contributions and highlighting the dependency relationship that had developed, I was able to demonstrate my value without resorting to destructive tactics. The result was not just personal satisfaction, but genuine career advancement based on recognized expertise. What surprised me throughout this process was how little awareness senior management had about the actual source of the department's regulatory expertise. Carlson's management style had created an attribution problem that obscured my contributions while inflating his apparent capabilities. My resignation letter forced a realistic assessment of the department's operations and capabilities. The weekend work that had seemed like professional sacrifice became the foundation for specialized expertise that was highly valued in the broader market. While the arrangement had been unsustainable under Carlson's management, the knowledge I gained during those weekends provided the credentials for senior-level compliance positions that offered both recognition and appropriate compensation. The clients who had benefited from my weekend research became advocates for my expertise when they learned about my departure. Their feedback to senior management provided external validation of my contributions and created opportunities for direct professional relationships. This client advocacy was more powerful than any internal performance evaluation in establishing my professional value. Perhaps most importantly, this experience taught me that professional vindication is not about defeating others, but about ensuring that expertise receives appropriate recognition. The goal was not to harm Carlson's career, but to establish my own professional identity, independent of his management and attribution practices. The strategic approach to resignation proved far more effective than emotional confrontation would have been. By focusing on facts and documentation rather than grievances and complaints, I was able to highlight legitimate concerns about recognition and attribution without appearing unprofessional or vengeful. The timing of the resignation, shortly after Carlson's comment about reliability, provided perfect context for senior management to understand the irony of the situation. Someone who had worked every weekend for 2 years was being characterized as unreliable because they had begun questioning an unsustainable arrangement. Today, 3 years after leaving Morrison & Associates, I occasionally encounter former colleagues at industry conferences. Several have mentioned that my departure prompted significant changes in how the firm manages its regulatory practice, including better recognition for analyst contributions and more sustainable workload distribution. These changes suggest that my resignation achieved broader positive impact beyond personal vindication. Carlson and I have crossed paths professionally a few times since my departure. Our interactions have been polite and professional, without lingering animosity from either side. I believe he eventually came to understand that our working relationship had been problematic, though I doubt he ever fully grasped the extent of his dependence on my weekend research. The consulting arrangement with Morrison & Associates concluded naturally when I accepted the Chief Compliance Officer position. The transition was smooth, and the firm expressed appreciation for my assistance during the capability gap that followed my departure. Senior management acknowledged that my resignation had highlighted important issues about workload distribution and professional recognition. Looking forward, this experience has shaped my approach to professional relationships and career development. I now prioritize roles where my expertise is properly recognized and attributed, and I'm careful to avoid situations where my contributions might be obscured by management structures or attribution practices. The weekend research that once seemed like professional burden has become a competitive advantage in the compliance field. The specialized knowledge I developed during those 2 years of weekend work provides insights that are valued by clients and colleagues alike. What appeared to be sacrifice was actually investment in expertise that has paid dividends throughout my subsequent career. For other professionals facing similar attribution issues, my experience suggests that strategic documentation and factual presentation are more effective than emotional confrontation. Professional vindication comes from demonstrating value rather than from proving others wrong. The goal should be career advancement based on recognized expertise rather than satisfaction from exposing incompetent management. The resignation letter remains one of the most important professional documents I have written, not because it damaged Carlson's career or embarrassed senior management, but because it clearly established my contributions and created opportunities for appropriate recognition. The letter opened doors to client relationships, consulting opportunities, and ultimately to the senior level position that reflected my actual expertise. In the end, being called unreliable while working every weekend for 2 years was the catalyst for professional vindication that might not have occurred otherwise. Carlson's comment provided the perfect opportunity to highlight the contradiction between perception and reality in our working relationship. Sometimes the most satisfying professional outcomes arise from the most frustrating professional circumstances. The epic nature of Carlson's reaction to my resignation letter was not dramatic confrontation, but rather the gradual recognition of how dependent his success had been on my weekend research. Professional vindication proved more satisfying than any emotional satisfaction could have been, because it resulted in genuine career advancement rather than temporary gratification. This experience confirmed that expertise, properly documented and strategically presented, creates its own opportunities for recognition and advancement. The weekend work that had been invisible to senior management became the foundation for client relationships and professional opportunities that reflected the true value of that expertise. Years later, when I tell this story to other compliance professionals, they often ask about regret or anger toward Carlson. The honest answer is that I feel neither. His management approach created an unsustainable situation, but it also provided opportunities to develop expertise that has been valuable throughout my career. Professional vindication was about moving forward rather than looking back. The most lasting impact of this experience has been understanding that professional success requires not just expertise, but also strategic thinking about recognition and attribution. Talent and hard work are necessary but not sufficient for career advancement. The ability to ensure that contributions are properly recognized and valued is equally important for professional success. Today, as Chief Compliance Officer, I am careful to ensure that team members receive appropriate recognition for their contributions. The attribution issues I experienced under Carlson's management have made me sensitive to how management practices can either support or undermine professional development for analytical staff. My own weekend work has become much more strategic, focused on professional development rather than simply meeting deadlines set by others. The expertise I developed during those 2 years of weekend research continues to inform my approach to compliance challenges, but now within a framework that provides appropriate recognition and career advancement opportunities. The story of being called unreliable while working every weekend for 2 years has become a professional anecdote that resonates with many compliance professionals who have faced similar attribution challenges. The experience of strategic resignation and professional vindication provides a model for addressing such situations constructively rather than destructively. Ultimately, this experience taught me that professional vindication is not about proving others wrong, but about ensuring that expertise receives appropriate recognition and creates opportunities for career advancement. The resignation letter was simply a tool for achieving this objective, and the epic reaction it generated confirmed that the strategy had been successful. The satisfaction of professional vindication has lasted far longer than any emotional gratification from exposing Carlson's dependence on my research would have. Building a career based on recognized expertise has proven more rewarding than any temporary satisfaction from professional confrontation could have been. This story continues to evolve as my career progresses, but the foundation remains the strategic decision to seek appropriate recognition for expertise rather than continuing in an unsustainable professional relationship. Sometimes the most professional response to being undervalued is simply to demonstrate your value elsewhere and let the results speak for themselves.